Welcome back, brothers and sisters. We're diving into an epic saga of battles and strategy, a tale from an ancient time, brought to life with a modern twist. Today we're exploring a modernized version of Julius Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, focusing on the intriguing events of Book 3. If you haven't checked out our videos on Books 1 and 2, you can find them in the playlist linked below. While they provide some thrilling context and are definitely recommended, don't worry, you can still fully enjoy and grasp the essence of today's narrative without them. And if you find value in joining us on this historical journey, consider supporting us on Patreon through the link in the description. Your support is like the backbone of an army, enabling us to forge ahead and bring more of history's treasures into the light. So grab your gear and prepare to march through history, witnessing strategies unfold and empires rise. Let's uncover the secrets of the past. Julius Caesar's Commentary on the Gallic War, Book 3. As Caesar was heading to Italy, he sent Servius Galba with the 12th Legion and some cavalry towards the Nantuates, Veragri, and Siduni. These tribes lived in the areas stretching from the lands of the Allobroges, Lake Geneva, and the River Rhone, all the way up to the top of the Alps. Caesar's reason for sending Galba was to secure and open up the Alpine Pass, a route that Roman merchants used to travel, albeit with significant danger and hefty tolls. Caesar gave Galba permission to position the legion in this region for winter if he deemed it necessary. After winning several battles and seizing some forts, Galba found himself surrounded by envoys from all sides. Peace was established, and hostages were handed over. Consequently, he decided to position 2 cohorts among the Nantuates and spend the winter with the rest of the legion in a village of the Veragri, known as Outtro. This village, nestled in a valley and accompanied by a small plain, was enclosed by towering mountains. The village was split into 2 by a river. Galba allocated one half to the Gauls and assigned the other half, left vacant by the Gauls, to the cohorts for wintering. He fortified this section with a rampart and a ditch. After spending several days in winter quarters and arranging for corn supplies, Galba was caught off guard. Scouts reported that the Gauls had vanished overnight from their part of the town, and the overlooking mountains were now swarming with a large force of Siduni and Veragri. Several factors led the Gauls to hatch a plan to reignite the war and target that legion. Firstly, they looked down on a single legion, especially one that wasn't at full strength. 2 cohorts were elsewhere, and several members were out gathering provisions. They also believed that given the tricky terrain, the Romans wouldn't be able to withstand even their initial assault, as they'd come charging down the mountains, weapons at the ready. Adding fuel to the fire was their resentment over their children being taken away as hostages. They were convinced that the Romans had their eyes on the Alpine peaks, aiming to annex those regions to the adjacent province of Gaul, securing not just the passes but establishing a permanent foothold. Upon receiving this alarming news, Galba, who hadn't fully completed the fortifications or gathered enough provisions, since he believed there was no threat of war after the surrender and receiving hostages, quickly called a council meeting to discuss their next moves. Given the sudden danger, and seeing the higher ground already teeming with armed forces, the situation looked grim. They couldn't expect reinforcements or supplies since the enemy had blocked the passes. Faced with this dire situation, some proposed a daring idea. Leave our baggage, break out and make a run for it, retracing the routes we took to get here. However, for the majority, it seemed wiser to keep that as a last resort, watch how things played out, and defend the camp in the meantime. In no time, with barely a moment to put their plans into action, the enemy, responding to a signal, swarmed from all sides, hurling stones and darts at our rampart. Our men stood their ground bravely while they still had the energy, not wasting any shots from their elevated position. Whenever a part of the camp seemed under pressure due to a lack of defenders, they rushed over to reinforce it. However, they faced a major disadvantage. The enemy could rotate. Tired warriors could exit the fray, replaced by fresh ones, something our men couldn't afford due to their limited numbers. Exhausted or not, retreat wasn't an option for the Romans, and even the wounded couldn't leave their assigned posts to get treatment. After more than 6 hours of relentless fighting, our men were not only drained of strength but also running out of weapons. The enemy, sensing this, pressed even harder, starting to tear down the rampart and fill up the trench. The situation was reaching a breaking point. At this critical moment, P. Sextius Baculus, a top-ranked centurion who had been severely wounded in a previous encounter with the Nervi, along with C. Volusenus, a tribune known for his skill and courage, rushed to Galba. They were adamant. The only shot at survival was to make a sally and lay it all on the line. Galba, quickly rallying the centurions, ordered the soldiers to take a brief break from the fighting, gather up any thrown weapons, and catch their breath. Then, at the given signal, they would burst forth from the camp, putting all their hopes of survival in their bravery and valor. Following the orders, our men made a sudden rush from all the camp gates, leaving the enemy no chance to figure out what was happening or regroup. The tables were turned. Those who had hoped to breach the camp were now surrounded and defeated. More than a third of an army of over 30,000 barbarians, that's how many were believed to have approached our camp, were eliminated, and the rest were sent into a panicked retreat, not even allowed to regroup on higher ground. With the enemy forces scattered and disarmed, our men returned to their camp and fortifications. After this battle, Galba, not wanting to push his luck and remembering his initial reasons for setting up winter quarters, decided it was time to pull back, especially given the shortage of food and supplies. The next day, after burning all the buildings in the village, he made a swift return to the province. Encountering no resistance on his way back, he safely led the legion first to the land of the Nantuates, then to the Allobroges, where they settled for the winter. With all these accomplishments, Caesar had every reason to think that Gaul was finally at peace. The Belgae were defeated, the Germans were driven out, and the Sidoni in the Alps were beaten. So at the onset of winter he headed to Illyricum, intending to get to know the nations there and learn about their territories. But just as he was doing so, a sudden war flared up back in Gaul. Here's what sparked it. Crassus, a young guy, had stationed the 7th Legion for winter among the Andes, who lived by the Atlantic Ocean. Since food was a bit scarce around there, he sent several officers and military tribunes to the neighboring states to sort out supplies and provisions. Among them, T. Terracidius went to the Asubii, M. Strebius Gallus to the Curiosolitai, and Q. Valanius and T. Silius were dispatched to the Venéti. The Venéti had a pretty significant influence among the coastal regions. They had a ton of ships, used to sail to Britain, and knew their way around nautical stuff more than anyone else. Plus, they controlled a few scattered ports along that tempestuous open sea, which made almost everyone trading there their tributaries. The Venéti kicked off the revolt by holding Silius and Valanius, hoping to exchange them for the hostages they had given to Crassus. Influenced by the Venéti's actions, the neighboring folks also detained Trebius and Terracidius with the same idea in mind. Quickly coordinating through their leaders, they vowed to act together and share the same fate, urging other states to cherish their ancestral freedom over Roman subjugation. Soon enough, the entire seacoast was following their sentiments. They sent a united message to P. Crassus saying, "If you want your officers back, send us our hostages." After learning about the situation from Crassus, Caesar, who was quite far away, ordered the construction of warships on the Loire River, which flows into the ocean. He had rowers drafted from the province and made sure sailors and pilots were on hand. With these arrangements swiftly sorted out, he rushed to join his army as soon as the seasons allowed. Getting wind of Caesar's arrival, the Venéti and other states realized the gravity of their actions. They had detained ambassadors, who were universally respected and untouchable, and imprisoned them. Realizing they were in hot water, they geared up for a significant conflict, especially focusing on naval resources, as their geographic location provided a natural defense. They knew their lands were surrounded by estuaries, making land access challenging, and sea access was tricky due to unfamiliar localities and scarce harbors. They banked on the Romans struggling with the lack of food and not being able to hang around for long. Even if things didn't pan out as expected, they were confident in their naval strength. They understood that the Romans lacked both ships and knowledge of the local sea terrain, shallow waters, and islands where the war was anticipated. Navigating the vast open ocean was a whole different ballgame compared to a narrow sea. Sticking to their plan, they fortified their towns, stockpiled food, gathered as many ships as they could to Venetia, where they thought Caesar would strike first. They rallied the Ossismii, Lexovii, Nanetes, Ambiliati, Morini, Diablintes, and Menapii as allies, and even called for reinforcements from Britain, which was just across the water from them. The challenges of the war were evident, but several factors pushed Caesar to press on. The blatant disrespect shown by detaining Roman knights, the uprising after surrender, the revolt despite giving hostages, and the alliance of so many states. Above all, he was concerned that if he let this slide, other nations might think they could get away with the same thing. Knowing the Gauls' penchant for rebellion and how quickly they could be spurred to war, and recognizing that everyone naturally craves freedom and detests subjugation, Caesar decided it was wise to spread his forces out before any more states could join the rebels. Caesar swiftly sends T. Labienus, one of his deputies, along with the cavalry to the Treviri, near the Rhine. He tasks him with keeping the Remi and other Belgians loyal and to fend off the Germans, who were rumoured to be aiding the Belgae if they tried to cross the river. P. Crassus is directed to head to Aquitania with 12 cohorts and a good number of cavalry to prevent these regions from sending support to Gaul and joining forces with them. Caesar dispatches another deputy, Q. Titurius Sabinus, with 3 legions to the Unelli, the Curiosolitai, and the Lexovii to ensure their troops remain separate from the others. He puts D. Brutus, a young officer in charge of the fleet and the Gallic vessels provided by the Pictones, the Santoni, and other peaceful provinces. Brutus is ordered to make his way to the Venéti as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Caesar himself rushes there with the infantry. The locations of their towns were usually on the tips of peninsulas, making them hard to approach by land during high tide, which happened twice in 12 hours. And with the tide going out, ships risked getting stuck on the shoals. This made attacking their towns pretty tricky. If the Venéti felt overwhelmed by our extensive constructions, like when we blocked the sea with mounds and dams, they didn't just give up. They had loads of ships, so they'd pack up, move to the closest towns, and use the same geographical advantages to defend themselves. They managed to do this for a good part of the summer since our ships were delayed by storms. Sailing was a real challenge in that vast open sea with its strong tides and scarce spread-out harbours. Their ships were constructed differently. The bases were flatter, making it easier for them to handle shallow waters and tides. The fronts and backs of the ships were raised high, ready to take on waves and storms. Built entirely from oak, these ships were tough, designed to withstand pretty much anything. The benches, made from foot-wide planks, were held together with iron spikes as thick as a thumb. Instead of cables, they used iron chains for anchors, and they had leather sails, maybe because they didn't have canvas, didn't know how to use it, or more likely, thought canvas couldn't handle the ocean storms, and that their heavy ships needed something stronger. When our fleet faced theirs, the only advantage we had was speed and rowing. Given the local conditions and frequent storms, their ships had the upper hand in pretty much everything else. Our ships' beaks couldn't damage theirs because they were so sturdy. The height of their ships made it hard for us to throw weapons onto them, and it also prevented them from getting stuck between rocks. Plus, when storms hit, they could navigate more easily and anchor safely in shallow waters. They didn't have to worry about rocks and sandbanks when the tide went out, which were significant risks for our ships. Caesar, having seized many towns and realizing that it wasn't slowing the enemy down, decided to wait for his fleet. When it arrived, about 220 fully equipped enemy ships sailed out to meet ours. Brutus, leading our fleet, along with the tribunes and centurions, were unsure about the tactics to adopt. They knew that their beaks wouldn't damage the enemy ships, and their ships were so tall that our weapons couldn't reach effectively while the Gauls could hit us hard. One clever thing our guys came up with was attaching sharp hooks to poles, kind of like what's used to attack town walls. These hooks grabbed the ropes tied to the masts, and when pulled and our ships moved forward, the ropes broke. Since the Gauls' ships relied heavily on their sails, cutting them off left them pretty much unmanageable. From there it was a battle of bravery, where our men clearly had the upper hand. Plus, the entire action went down right in front of Caesar and the whole army. Every bold move was seen, as our army had taken positions on the hills and high grounds with a good view of the sea. Seeing the sails of the enemy ships down, and even though each of our ships was surrounded by 2 or 3 of theirs, our soldiers energetically tried to board the enemy ships. Once the barbarians saw this happening and a bunch of their ships getting beaten, with no solution in sight, they tried to flee. But just as they turned their ships where the wind was blowing, a sudden calm hit, and they couldn't move. This situation was perfect for finishing the job. Our guys chased them down, capturing them one by one. Very few enemy ships made it to land, and this whole showdown lasted from about 10 in the morning till sunset. With that battle, the war against the Venéti and the entire seacoast was wrapped up. Every young person and the older ones, especially those with any smarts or status, had shown up for this fight. They'd brought together all the naval power they had, and when that was gone, the ones left had nowhere to go and no way to defend their towns. So they handed themselves and everything they had over to Caesar. Caesar figured he should be pretty tough on them. This way, any future tribes might think twice about messing with ambassadors' rights. So he executed their entire senate and sold everyone else into slavery. While all this was happening with the Venéti, Q. Titurius Sabinus rolled into the territory of the Unelli with the troops he got from Caesar. A guy named Viridovix was in charge here, leading a bunch of tribes that were all about rebelling, and he had a serious army ready to go. In just a few days, the Aulursi and the Sexovi joined the party, after offing their senate, who weren't keen on making war. Plus, a whole bunch of thrill-seekers and looters from all over Gaul joined in, ditching their day jobs for the promise of action and loot. Sabinus stayed put in his camp, which was a decent spot, while Viridovix and his crew set up camp about 2 miles away. Every day, Viridovix would bring his forces out, basically daring Sabinus to fight. This made Sabinus look pretty bad, not just to the enemy but also to his own troops. People were starting to talk, and the enemy even got bold enough to come right up to the camp's boundaries. Sabinus was playing it cool for a reason. He didn't think a lieutenant should risk a fight against a massive army, especially when the big boss, Caesar, was away, unless he had the upper hand or some sort of advantage. After letting everyone think he was scared, Sabinus pulled a clever move. He found a sneaky Gaul from his auxiliary crew, and with a combo of gifts and sweet promises, convinced him to play double agent and head over to the enemy's side. The plan: spread rumors. So this Gaul deserter tells Viridovix and his crew that the Romans are freaking out, that even Caesar's having a rough time, and that Sabinus is planning to sneak out at night to help Caesar. Hearing this, the Gauls went, "This is our chance. Let's attack." A bunch of things pushed them towards this decision. Sabinus playing it cool for days, the deserters' juicy gossip, their lack of food, because they hadn't planned well, feeling good about how things went with the Venéti, and the typical human thing of believing what you want to believe. They couldn't wait. They were so hyped that they didn't even let their leaders finish their meeting. Once they got the green light to grab their weapons and head for the Roman camp, they were on it. Super confident, they gathered sticks and stuff to fill the Roman trenches and made a beeline for Sabinus's camp. The Roman camp was set on a hill that gradually rose for about a mile. The Gauls, all hyped up, rushed there as fast as they could, giving the Romans barely any time to get ready. By the time the Gauls got there, they were totally winded. Sabinus, after giving his troops a pep talk, signaled the attack that they were all eager for. The Gauls were weighed down by the stuff they were carrying, so Sabinus ordered a sudden charge from 2 camp gates. The combo of the camp's strategic location, the Gauls' exhaustion and lack of skill, and the Romans' courage and battle experience meant the Gauls couldn't withstand the first assault. They quickly turned tail, and the Romans, all fired up, chased after the disorganized Gauls, taking down a bunch of them. The cavalry went after the rest, leaving only a few Gauls to escape. So while Sabinus got wind of the naval battle, Caesar heard about Sabinus's win, and all the neighboring regions quickly surrendered to Titurius. See, the Gauls might be fiery and quick to jump into war, but they're not exactly steadfast when facing tough times. Around the same time, Crassus rolled into Aquitania, which, as mentioned earlier, is pretty much a third of Gaul, given its size and population. He knew he was stepping into a hot zone, where just a few years back, Lieutenant L. Valerius Praeconinus got taken out and his troops scattered, and where Proconsul L. Manilius had to hightail it, leaving his gear behind. Crassus realized he had to step up his game. So he stocked up on food, got some local fighters and cavalry on board, and called in some tough guys from Tolosa, Carcasso, and Narbo, which are the local Gaul states bordering Aquitania. Then he marched his army into the land of the Sotiotes. Once they caught wind of his arrival, the Sociates rallied a big force, especially cavalry. That was their forte. They clashed with our marching army, starting with a cavalry skirmish. After their cavalry got the beat down and our guys were on their tail, they pulled a fast one by revealing their hidden infantry in a valley. These guys jumped our scattered troops and reignited the battle. The battle was intense and dragged on, with the Sociates, proud of their past wins, believing the fate of all Aquitania hinged on their bravery. On the flip side, our guys were eager to show what they could pull off without the main general and the other legions under a young leader. Eventually the enemy, battered and bruised, started to retreat. After many of them were taken down, Crassus moved on to lay siege to the main town of the Sociates. These folks put up a good fight, but Crassus wasn't having it. He set up siege equipment and towers. The Sociates tried everything, breaking out, digging tunnels to our defenses. They're pretty good at that, since they've got lots of copper mines in the region. But when they saw our guys weren't backing down, they caved and sent reps to Crassus, asking to surrender. Crassus agreed, but he had one condition. They had to hand over their weapons, and they did. So, while our guys were focused on this, in another part of town, Adcantuanus, the big boss, tried to break out with 600 of his loyal crew called Soldurii. Here's the deal with them. They live the good life with the buddies they've sworn loyalty to. If anything bad goes down, they either face it together or check out early. No one's ever heard of any Soldurii not willing to bite the dust if their buddy gets taken out. Anyway, Adcantuanus tried to get out with his squad, and when our guys heard the noise and ran to that part of the fortification, a serious fight went down. Adcantuanus got pushed back into the town, but Crassus cut him some slack, letting him surrender under the same terms as everyone else. Crassus, having collected the arms and hostages, moved on to the lands of the Vocates and Tarasates, but the locals, spooked by the news that we'd taken a well-fortified town within days, started making alliances, exchanging hostages and rallying troops. They even sent messengers to the nearby regions of Spain, pulling in reinforcements and experienced leaders. Feeling confident with their swollen ranks, they prepared for war. Among them were veterans of Q. Sertorius's campaigns in Spain, known for their military savvy. Adopting Roman tactics, they picked strategic locations, fortified their positions, and blocked our supply routes. Crassus noticed this and realized that with his limited troops they couldn't afford to split up. The enemy was making moves, guarding the supply routes, and growing in numbers, making it harder to get supplies. Seeing this, Crassus figured it was time to throw down. He called a meeting and finding everyone on the same page, he slated the showdown for the next day. At the crack of dawn, Crassus rolled out all his troops, setting them up in a double line, with auxiliaries in the center, waiting to see the enemy's move. Despite their numbers, their reputation in war, and our comparatively small squad, they figured they'd play it safe. Their plan was to block the routes and cut off our supplies, hoping to starve us out, then hit us while we were bogged down and low-spirited on the retreat. The leaders liked this plan, so even with our troops ready, the enemy stayed put in their camp. Crassus picked up on this. Seeing the enemy's hesitation, which only fired up our guys even more, and hearing the growing clamor to march on the enemy camp, he rallied his troops. With spirits high, he led the march straight to the enemy's doorstep, much to the delight of his soldiers. There, some of our guys were busy filling up the ditch, while others threw a ton of darts, pushing the defenders back from the walls and fortifications. The auxiliaries, who Crassus wasn't really counting on in the fight, were helping out by bringing in stones and weapons and carrying turf to the mound, looking every bit like they were in the thick of it. Meanwhile, the enemy was putting up a fierce fight, and since they were in a higher position, their weapons were landing some solid hits. Our cavalry, after scoping out the enemy camp, came back to Crassus with some news. They reported that the camp wasn't as well fortified on the side of the Decuman Gate, and it looked like we could make our move there. Crassus, after pep-talking the horse commanders with promises of rewards, laid out his plan. They followed orders, taking the 4 cohorts that had been chilling as camp guards, so they were fresh and ready. They looped around the long way to avoid being spotted from the enemy camp, while everyone there was super focused on the battle. Before the enemy knew what was happening, our guys had wrecked their fortifications and were inside their camp, causing a ruckus. When our guys heard the commotion, it gave them a second wind. There's nothing like the hope of winning to boost morale. They started fighting even harder. The enemy, now cornered with no way out, were panicking, trying to bail over the ramparts and make a run for it. Our cavalry chased them across the open plains, and when they finally got back to camp late at night, only about a quarter of the original 50,000 from Aquitania and the Cantabri were left standing. Hearing about this showdown, most of Aquitania decided they were on Team Crassus. They sent hostages as a peace offering, including folks from the Tarbelli, Bigeriones, Presiani, Vocasates, Tarusates, Elurates, Gaurites, Ausci, Garumni, Sibuzates, and Cocosates tribes. A few of the tribes, living way out in the sticks, figured they'd play it cool since winter was coming, and they didn't jump on the peace train just yet. Around the same time, Caesar, even though summer was almost over, decided to march his troops towards the Morini and Menapii territories. These tribes were the last ones still resisting, never having reached out to make peace. Caesar figured this war could be wrapped up quickly. The Morini and Menapii had a different war strategy compared to the other Gauls. Seeing the major Gaulish tribes defeated, and with their lands full of forests and swamps, they moved all their stuff to these tricky terrains. When Caesar got to the edge of these woods and started setting up camp, the enemy was nowhere in sight. But as soon as our guys were busy with their tasks, these tribesmen popped out from all over the forest, ambushing our men. Our guys quickly fought back, pushing them back into the woods. We lost a few good men, but managed to take down quite a number of theirs, especially when chasing them through those twisty, tangled places. In the following days, Caesar started clearing the forests. To protect the soldiers, who were unarmed and off guard, he used the cut-down timber to build barricades on either side, facing the enemy. Within a few days, a huge area was cleared super quickly. Our men had already seized the enemy's livestock and were catching up to their baggage train while the enemy looked for denser parts of the forest to hide in. Then the weather turned bad. Storms hit, halting the work, and the continuous rain made it impossible for the soldiers to stay in their tents. So, after ravaging their land, burning their villages and homes, Caesar pulled his army back and set them up in winter quarters among the Aulerci, Lexovi, and other tribes that had recently risen against him. Brothers and sisters, as we draw the curtains on another chapter of this ancient saga, we hope you've enjoyed marching alongside us through the pages of history, unraveling tales of strategy, courage, and conquest. Remember, by joining our ranks through Patreon, you're not just a spectator, but a valued ally, helping us bring more of these historical gems into the light. Your support fuels our journey, allowing us to delve deeper and bring history to life in more vivid colors. Until our next adventure, stay curious, keep exploring, and let the tales of old inspire your present and future. Farewell for now, and may the stories of the ancients guide your path.